Your Honor, I never imagined I'd be here struggling for the truth against my own husband. Mary's voice trembled, but her eyes burned like wildfire. It wasn't the shaky fear of someone intimidated by the system. It was the exhaustion of a woman who had carried the weight of a family, a business, and a dream on her back, only to be pushed aside like she was nothing. The courtroom was so still you could hear the distant hum of the ceiling light. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the thick air of people waiting, almost holding their breaths. Every seat was occupied. Reporters leaned forward, pens raised above notepads, prepared to make every tear, every word, every glare tomorrow's headlines. Family members sat rigidly in the gallery, their loyalties knotted in unseen threads. Strangers stood in, waiting to see a polygamous empire of once unassailable might publicly disintegrate. And then, there was Cody Brown. At the far end of the room, he sat with his attorney, arms folded like a statue hewn out of pride. His jaw clamped tight, his body radiating defiance. He never glanced at Meri, not once. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, as if he did not look at her, perhaps she would vanish. But today, nothing vanished. Today, the past had caught up with both of them in this courtroom. And it wasn't going anywhere quietly. Meri had practiced this moment in her mind 100 times. The procession to the witness stand, the judge's serious eyes, the whispers in the back row. But experiencing it was tougher. Like the air itself was lead. She clutched the wooden lip of the witness stand, her knuckles whitening. Her attorney, a brusque woman named Denise Holt, stood directly to her right, not touching, but close enough that Meri could sense her like a shield of protection. Denise nodded slightly. It said, "You've got this." It said, "He's not going to talk over you here." It told her, "This is your truth. Own it." It started months before. A cold November night. The house was still, only the occasional groan of the wooden floorboards breaking the silence. Cody was out. A business meeting, he'd said, and Meri had headed into their joint home office to print out some old family pictures to put into a scrapbook. That's when she noticed it. A cabinet she couldn't recall locking was open a little way. Inside, there wasn't much. A few envelopes, a folder, and a safe. The key to the safe, she remembered, was stashed inside a ceramic mug on the top shelf. She had put it there herself years earlier when Cody had asked her to keep it safe. She opened the safe. Inside were papers, dozens of them. Her name was omitted from nearly every one of them. Her gaze read words she wished she could erase. Transfer of ownership. Sole beneficiary. Disposition of partner. She sat there immobilized, the beating of her own heart ringing in her ears. For years, she had signed documents believing Cody's promise, believing that we was we, not him. But this was a masterfully spun net designed to force her out entirely. That evening, she didn't accuse him. She couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she started secretly gathering proof, printing copies, photographing them, stashing them where she would find them, and he wouldn't. Some nights, she lay awake with her eyes fixed on the ceiling, the burden of deceit weighing on her chest. She remembered the early days, when they'd stay up until 2 a.m. talking about their dreams, their plans, how they'd change the world together. She remembered long road trips to pitch their ideas to investors who laughed them out of the room. She remembered the first real profit they ever made, how they celebrated with cheap takeout and a toast with mismatched coffee mugs. She remembered loving him. She remembered trusting him. And now, she remembered every single time she had ignored the warning signs. In court, Meri's mind snapped back to the present as the judge adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Brown," he said gently, "you may continue." Meri took a deep breath. Her voice, though trembling, carried across the room. "I constructed this family with him. I constructed this company with him. And we were doing this together for years. But I was mistaken. I was a tool. Something convenient until I was no longer convenient. The words hurt, even as they escaped from her lips, but she refused to stop. When I discovered those files, I understood that the man I trusted had been wiping me out, not only from the company, but from the history of all we created. Cody shifted where he sat across the room. His attorney leaned in to whisper something, but his eyes darted toward Meri for an instant. It was the gaze of a man who underestimated the woman sitting opposite him. The silence in the aftermath of her speech wasn't hollow, it was charged. Reporters' pencils scribbled frantically on paper. Camera shutters snapped quietly. Someplace in the distance, someone let out a sudden breath, like they'd been in suspended animation. And then she spoke. The words that would be quoted in banner headlines the next day. I am not here for revenge. I am here because my voice matters, and I will not be erased. At that moment, Meri wasn't only speaking for herself. She was speaking for all those women who'd been instructed to just trust someone else with her future. For all the wives who signed contracts without reading them because love was safer than suspicion. For all the partners who'd given their entire soul into a dream and were told they didn't count. And the room knew it. They felt it. Even the judge leaned back slightly, as though allowing the full weight of her words to sink in. Cody's eyes hardened. He did not appreciate losing control. Not in business, not in marriage, and certainly not in public. But what he didn't realize, what he had never realized, was that Meri's strength didn't come from control. It came from surviving without it. It came from years of swallowing her anger, from learning to keep moving even when the person beside her was pulling in the opposite direction. And now, that strength was all that was keeping her upright. As Meri came down off the stand, her knees seemed on the verge of collapse. But her head remained high. Denise brushed her arm fleetingly, enough to hold her steady. The first fight was finished. The war had only started. The judge's gavel fell once, hard, authoritative. Mr. Brown, is it true you transferred the accounts without informing your wife? The question cut through the room like a knife. Everyone's eyes went to Cody. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he sat back in his chair, crossing his arms in the kind of casual smugness that made the silence worse. A smirk curved the corner of his mouth. Your Honor, he finally said, his tone dripping with confidence. We were never truly business partners. She was a helper. I made the decisions. The word helper landed like a slap. In the front row, Christine's lips pressed into a thin line. Janelle's brows furrowed. Even Robin, who had always defended Cody no matter what, looked uneasy. Meri sat frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears. Helper? She wished to laugh, shriek, and weep simultaneously. A helper does not stay up nights running payroll, so the employees are paid on time. A helper does not drive 12 hours nonstop to get to a meeting when a flight is canceled. A helper does not borrow against her own life savings to keep the company going when things turn tough. But she understood why he said it. By reducing her to just a helper, he was retelling the story, wiping out her part in front of everyone, including the jury. Denise stood up, each step toward the bench intentional. Your Honor, she started, her voice even but punctuated with steel. I'd like to introduce into evidence these signed agreements that identify Mrs. Brown as a co-owner of the business. We have copies for the court. She held aloft a fat stack of documents, the exact ones Meri had rooted out of that safe. A rustling of feet and murmurs ran through the crowd. One journalist's pen stalled in mid-sentence. The judge pushed up his glasses, perusing the headline of the first agreement. His forehead creased slightly. Mr. Brown, your name is right there. Care to comment? For the first time, Cody's smirk wavered. That was a formality, he replied hastily. It didn't imply that she had any power over the business. Denise missed no time. A formality? This letter specifically says equal ownership, profit sharing, and authority in decision-making. Are you saying you sign legally binding agreements as formalities? Several chuckles rose from the back of the room before the bailiff yelled for quiet. Meri didn't glance at Cody. She couldn't. Because if she had, then she might recognize the same man she used to love. The same man who grasped her hand when they signed their very first deal together. And that memory, that man, no longer existed. She turned her attention instead to the judge. "Your Honor," she said softly, "those signatures are not something to be taken lightly. They're my life's work, and he knows that." The space narrowed, walls closing in on the tension. Even the buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed louder. Cody's attorney, a tall guy with slicked back hair, stood and attempted to steer. "Let's not get carried away here. This is a family feud, not a corporate coup." Denise's eyes pinched. "When you sneak funds into accounts in one name and take away your partner's control, that's not a family debate. That's stealing." The term theft echoed like a shot. In the gallery, someone whispered, "Wow." Christine shifted in her chair, her fists clutched in front of her. She knew Cody had a controlling streak. She'd experienced it firsthand. But to see him warp reality so blatantly turned her stomach. Janelle looked over at Meri, her expression melting. Even Robin's eyes wavered before she hurriedly looked away. Cody picked up on the change in the room and leaned forward. "Meri, you understand how this is? I've always been the one to chart the course. You assisted. I'm not saying you didn't, but you can't be the captain when you didn't stand in the fire like I did." Her breath hitched. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "You mean the risks I bought and paid for? The loans I signed? The hours I worked while you were running around getting new wives rather than new deals?" Some gasps slipped out of the crowd. The judge held up a hand for silence, but the harm was done. Cody's coolness fractured. His jaw tensed, and his fingers tapped on the table. Denise pushed another piece of paper across the table to the judge. "This," she said, "is a letter from Mr. Brown to a private accountant, telling them to delete Mrs. Brown's name from all company accounts and letters. The date is 3 weeks prior to the so-called business restructuring he insists was mutual." Cody's attorney protested, but the judge's tone was unyielding. "Overruled. This is extremely pertinent." Meri followed Cody's face as the judge read the email out loud. His didn't change very much, but she saw it, that little flash of panic in his eyes. The same expression he'd worn the night she confronted him in private about the missing documents. She remembered that night well. They were in the kitchen. The kids were upstairs. She pushed the folder down the counter to him and said, "What is this, Cody?" He did not deny it. He did not apologize. He just rubbed his temples, took a deep breath, and said, "You wouldn't understand. This is for the best. For the best. For him, perhaps." Now, in a courtroom with the truth exposed, she understood something. This was not merely about money. It never had been. It was about control. It was about erasing her from the tale they had constructed together so he could stand alone in the limelight. The judge spoke at last. "Mr. Brown, this court will not stand for misrepresentation. The evidence clearly shows a conscious effort to erase Mrs. Brown from her rightful place in the business without permission." The murmur in the room became more insistent, but Meri hardly noticed. Her gaze remained fixed on the bench. Her fists tightened in her lap. She was seized with a jagged combination of fear and relief. Fear of what Cody would attempt next. Relief that, for once, the truth was being told in a room where he couldn't spin it. And in that instant, she knew something in her bones. He may still be struggling to maintain control. But in this courtroom, he was no longer above the law. The atmosphere within the courtroom was heavier now, as if each breath was heavy with the burden of years of secrets finally managed to claw their way out. Meri sat motionless at the witness stand, her attorney Denise by her side, the subtle smell of her biting perfume combining with the earthy odor of aged wood and paper. Outside, weak sunlight filtered through tall windows, dust motes floating softly in the light, a cruel jest to the seriousness of the moment. Denise placed a hand on the table, leaned in toward Meri, and whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "It's time." Meri knew exactly what that meant. She stretched out and pushed her frayed, leather-covered folder across the table. The seams were worn through, the spine creaked from being crammed into drawers and pulled back out again for years on end. To everyone else, it would have appeared to be an old, discarded binder. But to her, it was the lifeline, the armor, the weapon. She stood up gradually, each step towards the judge's bench measured. "Your Honor," she stated, her voice firm this time. "These are my years of effort, my blood, my sweat, my sacrifices. And these pages establish that I am not merely a helper. I am an owner." The judge waved for the bailiff to move the folder forward. As the bailiff passed it to him, the rustle of paper slid through the air. Every face in the room leaned in, the quiet swoosh of fabric and the groan of worn wooden chairs snapping the tension momentarily. Within were duplications of contracts, bank statements, tax returns, and scribbled notes from the first days of the company, all signed by both Cody and Meri. Some signatures were decades old, the ink dried, and the paper yellowing around the edges. Others were newer, evidence that her involvement wasn't just something of the past, but a current reality. As the judge began flipping through the folder, Meri's mind drifted, not out of distraction, but because every document in that folder was a memory. There was the first business license they ever registered, filed on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the two of them huddled under a too small umbrella, laughing about how this was the start of something big. And there were the bank statements for the year that they nearly lost everything when Meri had to pawn her grandmother's wedding ring to light the office. Cody had vowed they'd replace it once things improved. They never did. And then that one letter from an investor, singling out the impressive coordination and professionalism of Mrs. Meri Brown. Sentiments Cody had poo-pooed at the time as flattery, rather than properly crediting her. The judge placed the folder aside for a moment and stared at Cody. "Mr. Brown, is that your signature on these documents?" Cody cleared his throat, looking over at his attorney. "It is, but..." "But what?" the judge demanded, his voice getting colder. But they weren't ever intended to imply she had equal voice. It was in gesture. She didn't deal with the actual decisions. The judge raised an eyebrow. A gesture which just so happens to have the full weight of legal power under state business statutes? The blood left Cody's face just far enough for Meri to catch the change. For a man who had founded his reputation on confidence and control, even the faintest fissure was significant. Denise moved forward, producing the last page in the folder, a letter of authorization from a bank a mere 18 months previous. "Your Honor," she stated, "this document specifically grants Mrs. Brown equal access and approval power on all financial transactions. This isn't from the beginning. This is new. Mr. Brown signed this personally." The judge grasped the paper, scanning it hastily before placing it atop the pile. "This will be received into evidence." This brief statement hit Meri like a bolt of lightning. She had dreaded this moment for so long. Dreaded that somehow Cody's charm, his manipulation, his smooth words would distort the truth beyond recognition. But now, the truth sat there in black and white, and there was nothing he could do to make it disappear. In the gallery, Christine looked across at Janelle. Christine's eyes said, "She's winning this." Janelle's eyes said, "About time." Even Robin's usually unreadable expression softened for just a second. Meri's gaze finally met Cody's. It wasn't a glare, and it wasn't triumph. It was something colder. The quiet acknowledgement between two people who once built something together and now stood on opposite sides of a war they could never come back from. She had given him the spotlight for years, happy to work behind the scenes. She had felt that loyalty superseded recognition. She had felt that if the family succeeded, she succeeded. But this moment, this was the price of that conviction. The judge cleared his throat, interrupting the silence. "The court sees this evidence significant and pertinent. Mr. Brown, you shall be able to reply, but let me make one thing certain. These documents detail Mrs. Brown's involvement beyond any reasonable doubt." Cody's attorney shifted restlessly in his seat. Cody sat rigidly with his jaw clenched, his hands white-knuckled on the table's edge. Meri breathed slowly. She hadn't even known she'd been holding her breath until now. This wasn't finished, not by a long shot. But the tide had turned. For the very first time, she could sense it. Cody was no longer in charge here. And as she sat back down, her attorney leaned over and whispered, "That was the moment we turned the tide." Meri didn't smile. Not yet. But way down deep, she knew Denise was correct. The judge's words had hardly faded away before Cody inched forward in his chair, his demeanor beginning to break down. "This is absurd," he growled under his breath, softly enough so that the judge couldn't quite hear it, but loudly enough for the people nearest to catch. Mary's eyes flicked toward him. She had seen this before. This was the same Cody who used to raise his voice at home when he felt cornered, the one who would twist every argument into a story where he was the victim. But now, they weren't in their kitchen. They were in a courtroom with witnesses, a judge, and reporters scribbling every word. Cody's attorney put a hand on his arm, but he pushed it away. "Think this makes any difference?" Cody said at last. His voice raised now, aimed directly at Meri. "Meri, you would have been nothing if not for me. Nothing. You think you can steal my name, my company, and just walk out like you did it all on your own?" The words sat there like a stench. Somebody gasped in the gallery. The judge sounded the call for order at once, banging his gavel twice on the desk, but Cody wasn't done. "I'm the reason we have anything at all. I took the risks. I made the connections. Without me, you'd still be working a dead-end job wondering how to pay the bills." Meri didn't blink. She didn't even flinch. Her response came quietly, but as cutting as shattered glass. "Without you, Cody, I could have had peace. I could have had a life where I was not a servant to a dream that never belonged to me. And I am not taking your name. I am reclaiming my dignity." For an instant, it was as if the entire room forgot to inhale. Even the court reporter, fingers dancing on the stenograph machine, hesitated for a split second before regaining her momentum. The judge raised a hand for silence again, but the emotions had already spilled over. In the gallery, Christine stared at the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She knew that tone in Meri's voice, the quiet, calm resolve of someone who had finally reached their breaking point. Janelle kept her eyes on Cody, as if studying the exact moment when his mask slipped for good. And Robin's face was white. She gazed from Cody to Meri and back, as if unsure which world to trust anymore. Cody's voice trembled now, but not with fear, with rage. "You're doing this to hurt me, Meri. You want to humiliate me before everyone." Her voice remained calm. "You shamed yourself when you determined that my value was lower than yours. I remained quiet for years. I remained faithful when you didn't deserve it, and now I'm finished pretending." Denise put her hand gently on Meri's arm, not to halt her, but to remind her that she was winning this fight without having to raise her voice. The judge's voice became more stern. "Mr. Brown, you will speak to the court with respect. Continue doing this, and I will hold you in contempt." Cody leaned back, scowling, but the flame in his eyes was a different one. It wasn't the flame of a man who was in charge. It was the flame of a man seeing his authority slip away from him. For Meri, the moment was surreal. She thought back to all the occasions during their marriage when Cody's rage had been the last word. When the louder he became, the more she retreated into herself, just to maintain the peace. But this wasn't their living room. Here, she wasn't alone. Here, his words didn't delete hers. The room tension was a living entity now, vibrating in the air like static preceding a storm. Reporters wrote faster, cameras fired in quick staccato bursts, and a buzz of mumbled side conversations filled the background. Denise rose to speak to the judge. "Your Honor, my client has shown remarkable restraint given the hostility she's endured today. I'd like to remind the court that this case is about financial misconduct and breach of trust, not character attacks." The judge nodded, making a note. "The court is aware. Let's proceed." But the damage to Cody's image was already done. Each tantrum, each put-down had been witnessed, captured, and viewed by individuals who would think about it repeatedly in their heads, and probably on the nightly news. Meri breathed in slowly, her hands shaking. Not out of fear, but release. For so long, she had rehearsed this moment in her mind. The day she would stand across from him, look him in the eye, and speak her truth without being interrupted, without being gaslit into believing she was wrong. And now, she'd done it. In the back row, Christine finally looked up, catching Mary's eye for the briefest second. She didn't smile, but her eyes spoke volumes. Keep going. He can't stop you now. And Meri understood. This was no longer just about money. This was about proving to him and to everyone else that her silence had never been weakness. The judge ordered a brief recess, allowing both sides time to catch their breath. When the bailiff called for the recess, Cody hunched over to his attorney, grumbling in rage. Cody's words were too quiet to hear, but the rubbing of his attorney's forehead spoke volumes. Cody was losing his grip, and even his own attorney recognized it. Meri remained in her seat, fingers clasped in her lap. Denise bent down. "You didn't just stand your ground," she breathed. "You shattered his?" Meri didn't smile. Not yet. There was still a verdict to be reached. But deep down, she knew. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one breaking. The whole courtroom was silent, as if it were holding its breath as the judge came back from deliberation. Meri was motionless, hands clasped around the rim of the table, heart racing so hard she could hardly hear anything else. Cody sat facing straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his eyes avoiding hers. The judge cleared his throat. Having reviewed the evidence, "This court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Meri Brown." Gasps filled the room. A murmur spread among the reporters in the back. Mary's lips trembled, not from shock, but from the weight of everything crashing down at once. She had won. After years of being silenced, ignored, and betrayed, her truth had finally been recognized. Cody fidgeted in his seat, his attorney whispering urgently into his ear. His customary smirking face was nowhere to be found. Instead, something Meri had never witnessed. Fear. The judge resumed, his tone authoritative. "Mr. Brown, you are directed to turn over all ill-gotten funds and business property to their rightful joint ownership. Or, in addition, you are enjoined from making any unilateral financial actions regarding jointly held family property." It was better than Meri had dared hope. This wasn't a courtroom victory. It was the public acknowledgement that what Cody had committed was wrong. Meri could feel tears welling at the edges of her eyes, but she suppressed them until the gavel came down. The sound of it was like the last door slamming shut on the life she'd left behind. She stood, collecting her belongings. Reporters swarmed forward, calling out questions, cameras blinding. "Meri, how do you feel about winning against your husband? Do you think this is the end of the Brown family empire? What's next for you?" She hesitated on the courthouse steps, addressing the forest of microphones. Her voice was even, but immovably firm. "This was never about breaking up a family," she told me. "It was about defending myself. And for anyone who's ever been told to shut up when they've been hurt, no one, not even someone you love, has the right to take your voice away." As she disappeared into the distance, the sun burst through the clouds in the afternoon. She was finally free for the first time in years. The weight was lifted. The fear was lifted. She was Meri Brown, not merely the first wife, not merely a fragment of a dying polygamous dream, but a woman who had endured the tempest and emerged standing. Behind her stood Cody, in the doorway of the courthouse, and he saw her walk away. The man who had had all the power now stood small against the light. And deep down, Meri knew. This was not the end of their fight. It was the start of her new life.